I had been working at Dunkin for almost a year, and by that point, I had seen my fair share of odd customers. Some people would come in every single day, ordering the same thing like clockwork. Others would show up at strange hours, looking disoriented or half asleep. Late-night shifts attracted all sorts of strange characters: overly friendly drunks, exhausted truck drivers, the occasional teenager trying to loiter without getting kicked out. But none of them ever made me feel truly uncomfortable. That changed when he started coming in. It was a Tuesday night, just after 10:30 p.m., and I was working the closing shift. The store was quiet, with only one or two customers lingering near the back. I was wiping down the counter when the chime above the door rang, signaling that someone had just walked in. I glanced up, expecting to see the usual kind of late-night customer, someone in need of caffeine or a quick bite before heading home. Instead, I saw a man in a baggy gray hoodie, the hood pulled up so tight that it nearly covered his face. He walked straight to the counter without hesitation, his movements smooth and almost mechanical. He stared at the menu for a few moments, not acknowledging me, before finally speaking in a flat, expressionless tone. "Do you have the whole wheat bagel?" I turned to check the order screen. "Sorry, we're out of that one for the night." His head tilted slightly, as if he hadn't expected that answer. He didn't look frustrated or confused, just off. His posture was rigid, and he didn't fidget or move the way most people do when they're waiting for something. After a few seconds of silence, he turned on his heel and walked out the door without another word. I watched him leave, feeling vaguely unsettled. Most customers would at least order something else if we didn't have what they wanted. But he had just walked in, asked for that specific bagel, and left when he couldn't get it. I shrugged it off. People were weird sometimes. But then, the next night, he came back. It was almost the exact same time, a little past 10:30 p.m., when the door chime rang again. I looked up from the register, and there he was. Same gray hoodie, same slow walk to the counter. He stared at the menu for a few moments, then asked, word for word, the same question as the night before. "Do you have the whole wheat bagel?" I checked the screen, even though I already knew the answer. "No, we're still out of that one." His head tilted again, just like before. And just like before, he turned without another word and walked straight out the door. That was when I felt it, that first prickle of unease crawling up my spine. The repetition, the way he moved, the way he acted as if he had never been there before, as if he wasn't aware that he had asked me the exact same thing just the night before. When I told my coworker about him, she laughed. "Maybe he's just messing with you," she said. "Or maybe he's a robot." I chuckled, trying to brush it off. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. By the third night, I was already dreading his arrival. I kept glancing at the clock, waiting for the inevitable. And sure enough, at almost the exact same time, the door chimed and he walked in. Same hoodie, same blank expression, same unsettling stillness. He didn't even hesitate. He walked straight up to the counter and asked, in that same flat voice, "Do you have the whole wheat bagel?" I felt my stomach twist. It was like watching a glitch in reality. I forced myself to smile. "No, man. Still don't have it." This time, he didn't immediately leave. He stood there longer than usual, staring at me. His head didn't tilt like before. He just watched. The silence stretched between us, thick and unnatural, and for a moment, I was sure he was going to say something else. But then, just as suddenly as he had come in, he turned and left. I let out a slow breath. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't normal. The fourth night was when I started to feel afraid. It was raining that evening, and the store was quieter than usual. I was cleaning up behind the counter when I heard the chime. My heart immediately jumped into my throat. I knew who it was before I even turned around. And sure enough, there he was. But this time, something was different. His hoodie was soaked through, sticking to his body, the fabric dark and heavy with rain. He left wet footprints on the tile floor as he stepped forward, moving just as slowly as always. But when he finally spoke, his voice sounded strange, like it was weaker, like he was struggling to get the words out. "Do you have the whole wheat bagel?" I felt my hands tighten on the counter. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. This time, he didn't tilt his head. He just stared at me, longer than before. His hood had slipped slightly, revealing part of his face. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his lips were slightly parted, his breath shallow and uneven. Water dripped from his sleeves, pooling on the floor beneath him. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. Then, finally, he turned and walked out. I didn't move until the door swung shut behind him. Then I turned to my coworker and said, "If he comes back tomorrow, I'm calling the cops." But the next night, he didn't come inside. He just stood outside. I only noticed him because I happened to glance up while cleaning the counter. At first, I thought it was just a reflection in the glass. But when I looked closer, I realized he was standing just outside the window, staring. His hood was still up, his body still drenched from the rain, his hands pressed against the glass. Watching me, I felt my breath catch in my throat. I turned to my coworker, whispering, "He's outside." She followed my gaze and went completely still. What the hell? I took a slow step toward the window, trying to get a better look at his face. But the second I moved, he stepped backward, then again, and again, slowly fading into the darkness, until he was gone. I never saw him again after that. But to this day, I still don't understand what he wanted. Was it some kind of joke? A test? Or was he waiting for me to say something different? Something that never happened? I don't know, but I still think about him. And sometimes, when I pass by the window at work, I swear I see the faint outline of handprints on the glass, like someone had been standing there, watching, waiting. I never thought stopping for a coffee on my way to work would turn into one of the scariest nights of my life. Dunkin was part of my daily routine. I'd stop in, grab my usual, and be back on the road in under 5 minutes. It was never something I put much thought into, until that night. Until the night a stranger got into my car, while I was still in it. It was late, almost midnight, when I pulled into the nearly empty Dunkin parking lot. I had just finished a long shift at my job and needed something to keep me awake on the drive home. The parking lot was poorly lit, with only a few dim streetlights casting pale yellow pools onto the pavement. A couple of other cars were scattered around, mostly near the drive-thru. I parked near the entrance, figuring I'd only be inside for a few minutes. As I stepped out, I took a quick glance around. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. There was no one loitering, no one walking toward me, just the quiet hum of cars passing in the distance. I should have locked my doors, but I didn't. Inside, the store was nearly empty. A tired-looking cashier greeted me with a nod as I walked up to the counter. I ordered my usual, a medium coffee, cream, and sugar, then stepped aside to wait. The only other customer was a man sitting near the window, hunched over his phone, barely acknowledging my presence. A couple of minutes passed before my order was ready. I grabbed my coffee, gave the cashier a quick thanks, and headed back outside. The air was crisp, the sky dark and starless, the parking lot eerily silent. Then, just as I reached my car, I noticed something. A man was standing near my passenger side door. At first, I thought he was just another customer. Maybe he had parked next to me and was heading inside. But as I stepped closer, I realized he wasn't moving. He was just standing there, facing my car, his hands in his jacket pockets. Something about the way he stood, so unnaturally still, made my stomach clench. I hesitated, my keys gripped tightly in my hand. Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer, didn't even turn his head, just stood there, staring at the passenger door like he was waiting for something. My instincts screamed at me to get in my car and leave. But before I could move, he opened the door and got in. For a split second, my brain refused to process what was happening. I just stood there, frozen, my breath caught in my throat as this complete stranger sat down in the passenger seat like he belonged there. The worst part? He shut the door. Like this was normal. Like we had done this before. My heart slammed against my ribs as adrenaline surged through me. "What the hell are you doing? Get out of my car." I snapped, taking a step back. Finally, he turned his head toward me. His face was expressionless. His eyes were dark, sunken, like he hadn't slept in days. His lips parted slightly, and for a brief moment, I thought he was about to say something. Then, without warning, he lunged for the keys in my hand. I jerked back just in time, his fingers grazing my wrist as I stumbled away from the door. My coffee slipped from my grasp, splattering onto the pavement as I scrambled backward. The man didn't hesitate. He reached over, grabbed the inside lock, and pushed down, locking the doors from the inside. Then, he turned to look at me through the window, and he smiled. Not a normal smile, not a friendly smile. A slow, deliberate, unnerving grin, stretching across his face as he lifted his hand, my keys now dangling from his fingers. My stomach dropped. That's when I realized he was about to steal my car. Panic surged through me as I lunged toward the driver's side door, yanking at the handle, but it was locked. "Get out of my car!" I shouted, pounding on the window. He didn't react, didn't flinch. He just turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. "No, no, no, stop." I slammed my fist against the glass, desperation clawing at my throat. My mind raced for a solution, but I was out of time. With one final glance at me, that same twisted smile still plastered on his face, he slammed his foot on the gas. The tires screeched against the pavement as my car jerked forward. I barely had time to stumble back before the car sped out of the parking lot, disappearing into the night. I was left standing there, heart hammering, breath ragged, with nothing but my spilled coffee at my feet. And my car was gone. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking as I called 911. My voice was a mess, frantic, stumbling over my words, but they understood enough. Within minutes, a police car pulled into the lot, its lights flashing. I told them everything. I described the man: average height, gaunt face, dark hoodie, sunken eyes. I told them how he had been waiting near my car, how he had gotten in without a word, how he had just sat there until I made the mistake of getting close enough for him to grab my keys. The officer nodded, taking notes. Then he sighed. "We'll put out an alert for your vehicle," he said, voice grim. "But I won't lie to you. Car thefts like this? Sometimes we don't find them." My stomach churned. The officer must have seen the look on my face because he hesitated, then added, "But you said he didn't run. He didn't seem desperate. Didn't seem like he was in a hurry?" I nodded slowly. "That's unusual," he muttered, glancing at his partner. "Most carjackers don't stick around like that. They grab and go. But this guy, he waited." I swallowed hard. "What does that mean?" I asked. The officer didn't answer, but his silence said everything. They found my car 2 days later, abandoned on the side of a highway, miles away. The inside was trashed, seats ripped open, the dashboard scratched like someone had clawed at it. The radio had been ripped out, the glove compartment torn apart, but nothing of value had been taken. It was like the man had been looking for something, or worse, like he had just sat there for hours, doing God knows what. They never caught him. They never figured out why he took my car, where he had planned to go, or what he had done in the hours before he abandoned it. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that smile, that slow, unnerving grin he gave me before he drove away. And I can't help but wonder, was he really just stealing my car? Or was he waiting for something more? Working the night shift at Dunkin was usually boring. Sure, we had the occasional weird customer, people wandering and half asleep, late-night truckers, or drunks looking for something to soak up the alcohol. But most of the time, it was just me, the hum of the coffee machines, and the ticking clock counting down to the end of my shift. That's what I thought before that night. Before the man who didn't just walk in. Before the man who jumped over the counter. It was around 2 a.m., and the store was completely empty. The usual late-night rush had died down, and I was alone at the front while my coworker, Jake, was in the back room doing inventory. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting a dull glow over the empty tables and chairs. I leaned against the counter, scrolling through my phone, waiting for time to pass. Then, the door chimed. I looked up and saw a man walk in. He was tall, with greasy, shoulder-length hair, and a hood pulled halfway over his face. His clothes were dirty, not just unwashed, but stained, like he had been wearing them for weeks. There was something off about the way he moved, his steps slow and deliberate, like he wasn't entirely sure of where he was. Still, I forced a polite smile. "Hey man, what can I get for you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the farthest booth in the store and sat down with his back to me. That was the first red flag. Most people who come into a nearly empty Dunkin' at 2 a.m. at least glance at the menu. Even the ones who just want to sit and warm up usually make eye contact, acknowledge your presence. But he didn't. He just sat there, completely still, his head slightly tilted downward, as if he were listening to something I couldn't hear. I waited for a few minutes, expecting him to get up and order, but he never moved. The unease in my stomach tightened. Finally, I cleared my throat and called out, "Hey, man, you planning on ordering something?" No response. I shifted uncomfortably. Was he homeless? Hi, just some guy looking for a place to sit? Whatever it was, I decided to leave him alone. As long as he wasn't causing trouble, didn't want to deal with a confrontation. But then, I turned away for 2 seconds, and suddenly, he was standing at the counter. I jumped, nearly dropping my phone. I hadn't heard him move. At all. 1 second, he had been sitting in that far booth. The next, he was standing directly in front of me, his long, stringy hair partially covering his face. For a moment, I just stared at him. My pulse pounded in my ears. "What can I get for you?" I asked, my voice tighter than before. He didn't answer, didn't move, didn't even blink. He just stood there, breathing softly, staring straight ahead. A deep, crawling unease settled into my chest. I tried again. "Sir?" Nothing. And then, without warning, he jumped over the counter. I barely had time to react. 1 second, he was standing still. The next, his body was in the air, vaulting over the counter like he had done it 100 times before. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of cement. He landed right in front of me, too close. I could smell him now, a horrible, rotting stench, like old sweat and something worse. His hoodie hung loosely around his thin frame, his ribs pressing against the fabric. His breath came out in shaky gasps, his lips parted slightly. I opened my mouth to scream, but he moved again. He dropped to the floor behind the counter, crouching, his long fingers pressed against the tile, like he was hiding, like he was waiting. My heart slammed against my ribs. I forced myself to step backward, toward the hallway that led to the back room. If I could just reach Jake. Then, he started crawling. Not standing, not walking, crawling, on all fours, like some kind of deranged animal, his bony limbs twisting unnaturally as he moved. He didn't lunge at me, didn't attack. He just slid across the floor, pushing himself into the dark corner under the coffee machines. And then, he stopped, completely still, curled up like a spider in its nest, watching me. That was it. I turned and ran. I slammed through the backroom door so hard it rattled against the wall. "Jake," I gasped. There's a guy. He just jumped the counter." Jake frowned, setting down the clipboard he had been holding. "What?" I pointed behind me, my hands shaking. He's under the coffee machine." Jake didn't wait for an explanation. He grabbed the metal mop handle we kept in the back and pushed past me, storming toward the front of the store. But by the time we got there, the man was gone. The door hadn't chimed. There were no sounds of footsteps, but somehow he had vanished. Jake and I checked everywhere, behind the counter, in the supply closets, even outside in the parking lot. But the only sign that anyone had been there was the faint, grimy handprints smudged against the tile floor, like something had crawled across it. The cameras were no help either. The old security system was grainy, and when we played back the footage, all we saw was me reacting to something that wasn't there. Jake tried to laugh it off, saying maybe I had just been sleep deprived. Maybe I imagined the whole thing. But I knew what I saw. I felt him move. I smelled him. I heard his breathing. And that wasn't the worst part. A week later, the cops showed up at the store. They found a homeless man hiding in the abandoned building across the street. When they searched his makeshift shelter, they found something even worse. A collection of napkins and receipts, all from our Dunkin' store, and scrawled across them, in jagged, uneven handwriting, were the words, "I live here now." I quit 2 days later. Jake stayed, but sometimes, when we talk, He tells me that things still go missing from behind the counter. Sometimes, he'll find handprints on the floor in the morning, like someone has been crawling there at night. And sometimes, the security cameras catch movement in the kitchen, even when the store is supposed to be empty. I never thought stopping for a quick coffee could turn into something so terrifying. Dunkin' had always been my go-to place in the mornings. A large iced coffee, maybe a bagel if I had the time, and then off to work like every other day. It was just part of my routine. But some routines get noticed, and sometimes the wrong person notices. It started on an ordinary Thursday morning. The Dunkin' near my work wasn't big, just a small location attached to a gas station. I had been stopping there almost every day for months, usually at the same time, around 7:30 a.m., just before the morning rush. I liked it that way. Fewer people, faster service, no unnecessary interactions. That morning, I pulled into the parking lot, parked in my usual spot near the entrance, and headed inside. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, blending with the faint scent of gasoline from the station next door. I barely noticed the other customers as I stepped up to the counter, ordered my usual, and waited. That's when I felt it. Someone watching me. It wasn't unusual for people to glance around while waiting for their order, but this felt different. It wasn't just a casual look. It was direct, intentional, unwavering. I turned my head slightly, pretending to check my phone, and that's when I saw him. A man sitting at one of the small tables near the window, wearing a dark green hoodie. He had short, greasy hair, a thin face, and sunken, tired eyes that never blinked. But what unnerved me the most wasn't how he looked. It was that he was staring directly at me. I quickly looked away, pretending I hadn't noticed, and shifted uncomfortably. Maybe he was just some weird guy. Maybe he was lost in thought. But I could feel his eyes on me. Even when I grabbed my coffee and walked toward the door. Even as I stepped outside and headed for my car. Even as I pulled out of the parking lot. He didn't look away. I told myself it was nothing. Just some guy spacing out. Nothing more. But the unease sat in the back of my mind for the rest of the day. And the next morning, when I went back to Dunkin', he was there again. Sitting at the same table, in the same green hoodie, with the same hollow stare locked onto me the moment I walked inside. This time, my stomach twisted. It wasn't just a coincidence. It wasn't just some random guy who happened to be at the same place at the same time. He was waiting for me. I considered turning around and leaving, but I didn't want to make it obvious that he was freaking me out. Instead, I kept my eyes forward, ordered quickly, and avoided looking in his direction. But as I stood there, waiting for my coffee, I felt the weight of his gaze pressing against my back. Then, footsteps. Soft, slow, deliberate. Coming closer. My pulse spiked. I gripped my phone tighter, pretending to be distracted, pretending not to notice. "Hey." The voice was hoarse, dry, like he hadn't spoken in days. I swallowed hard and turned my head slightly. He was standing right beside me now, too close, his breath faintly sour with coffee and something stale. "You come here a lot," he said. I forced a tight smile. "Yeah, I guess." He didn't blink, didn't move, just stood there, watching me. Then he said, "What's your name?" I lied. I gave him a fake name, something generic. I don't even remember what I said. He just nodded slowly, as if rolling the name around in his head, then smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they think they already know you. "You live around here?" he asked. A chill ran through me. "Nah, just passing through." Another lie. His smile didn't fade. "You work around here?" I grabbed my coffee the second it hit the counter. "Look, man, I gotta get going. Have a good one." I turned fast and walked out, my heart hammering. My hands were shaking as I unlocked my car. I got inside and locked the doors, trying to steady my breathing. I looked in the rearview mirror. He was standing at the window, still staring, still smiling. For the next few days, I changed my routine. I went to a different coffee shop. I took different routes to work. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Then, on Monday, I went back to Dunkin', and he was there, sitting at the same table, drinking coffee, staring out the window, waiting. The second I walked in, his eyes locked onto me. His smile widened, like he knew I'd come back. like he had been expecting me. I turned on my heel and walked straight out the door. I didn't stop, didn't look back, but as I got into my car, I saw something in my mirror that made my blood go cold. He was already outside. I drove straight to work, heart pounding, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I parked in the back lot, took a few deep breaths, and told myself it was over. But then, an hour later, my coworker walked up to me, confused. "Hey man, someone's been sitting outside in their car for a while. He keeps looking over here." My stomach dropped. I walked to the window, my body cold with dread, and there, across the lot, in a beat-up old sedan, was the man in the green hoodie, sitting completely still, watching me. I didn't go outside for lunch that day. I didn't leave the building at all, and by the time my shift ended, the car was gone. I drove home, constantly checking my mirrors, taking different turns, making sure I wasn't being followed. I pulled into my driveway, heart still racing, hands shaking as I stepped out of my car. And then, my phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. I hesitated before opening it, and when I did, my stomach dropped. "Nice house. See you tomorrow." I don't remember much after that. I just remember the fear. Calling the cops. Them not being able to do anything. Changing my number. Taking time off work. For a while, I stopped going to Dunkin completely. I drove different routes every day. I started carrying a knife. But no matter how much I changed my routine, I always felt like someone was watching. And sometimes, late at night, I'd catch a glimpse of a green hoodie in my rearview mirror. A car parked down the street. Headlights on. Engine running. Waiting. Closing up at Dunkin was usually the easiest part of my shift. The customers were gone, the rush was over, and it was just a matter of cleaning up, counting the registers, and locking everything down before heading home. I had worked the night shift for almost a year, and nothing about it had ever made me uneasy. If anything, I liked the solitude. It was peaceful in a way. Just me, the hum of the coffee machines, and the slow process of shutting everything down. But that night, I realized something. That false sense of security, that feeling of routine, that's exactly when you're most vulnerable. Because when you're comfortable, when you assume everything is normal, that's when you don't notice the danger. That's when you don't realize that someone's been hiding in the store all along. It was just after midnight when I locked the front doors. The last customer had left about 20 minutes earlier, and I had already wiped down the counters and stacked the chairs on top of the tables. My coworker, Mike, had finished his shift an hour earlier, so it was just me in the store. I liked being alone. The quiet gave me time to think, to move at my own pace, to listen to music in one ear while I cleaned. But that night, I should have paid more attention, because I didn't notice that something was wrong. Not right away. Not until it was almost too late. I had just walked into the storage room to grab the mop when I heard it, a sound that shouldn't have been there. It was faint, almost like fabric rustling against fabric, but in the dead silence of the empty store, it sent a chill straight down my spine. I froze, my fingers tightening around the mop handle. My heart was already pounding, and I didn't know why. It was probably nothing. Maybe I had left the air conditioning on too high. Maybe I had knocked something over without realizing it. But then I heard it again, a soft shuffle, like a footstep, coming from inside the store. I slowly stepped out of the storage room, my breath caught in my throat. The overhead lights buzzed softly, illuminating the empty dining area. Everything was exactly where I had left it. The chairs were stacked, the register was closed. The glass display cases were spotless. But something felt off. I couldn't explain it, but it was like the air itself had changed, like the store was holding its breath. I took a step forward, my sneakers squeaking against the freshly mopped floor. Then, a shadow moved. I only caught it for a split second, out of the corner of my eye, near the booths in the back. A quick, jerky motion, like something or someone had just ducked down behind the seating. I felt my stomach drop. Someone was still inside the store. Someone was hiding. A wave of cold fear washed over me as I stood there, completely still, trying to listen. I wanted to believe I was imagining things. Maybe it was a shadow from the streetlights outside. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me after a long shift. But then I heard it. A breath. Soft, slow and deliberate, coming from the far corner of the store. I wasn't alone. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady as I called out, "Hello?" No response. Nothing but silence. The kind of silence that made my skin crawl. I took a step forward, my hands tightening around the mop handle. "Hey, if someone's in here, the store is closed. You're not supposed to be here." Still nothing. No movement. No response. Just the overwhelming feeling that something was watching me. I reached for my phone, my other hand still gripping the mop like a weapon. I was about to dial 911 when something moved. Fast. Too fast. A dark figure suddenly bolted out from behind the booth and ran. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat as the figure sprinted toward the counter. But not toward the door. Not toward an exit. He ran behind the counter. Right toward me. I barely had time to react. 1 second, I was standing there, frozen. The next, he was vaulting over the counter, his body moving in a way that didn't seem natural. I staggered backward, gripping the mop like it would actually do something. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get out, to move. But my body wouldn't listen, because now that he was closer, I could see him. His clothes were filthy, stained with something dark that I didn't want to think about. His hair was matted, sticking to his forehead in clumps. But it was his face that terrified me the most. His skin was pale, almost gray, his cheekbones sharp and hollow. His eyes, wide, bloodshot, and sunken deep into his skull, locked onto me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. And his lips were moving, but no sound was coming out. He was whispering to himself, like he was practicing something. Then, he dropped to the floor. He didn't stand, didn't walk. He crawled, on all fours, his hands and feet sliding across the tile, his body twisting in unnatural ways. He wasn't attacking. He wasn't lunging at me. He was hiding. He curled himself up into a dark corner under the coffee machines. And then, he stopped, completely still, watching me. I ran. I slammed through the backroom door, nearly tripping over my own feet. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped my phone. I locked the door behind me and dialed 911. I could still hear him, his breathing, shaky, uneven gasps, like he was waiting, like he was listening. By the time the cops arrived, the store was empty. There was no sign of him, no forced doors, no broken windows. It was like he had never been there. But the police found something, a crumpled receipt, stuffed into the corner beneath the register. There was writing on it, scrawled in jagged, uneven letters. Only 4 words. "I live here now." I quit the next day. Mike still works there. But sometimes, when we talk, he tells me that things still go missing from behind the counter. That he hears noises at night. That sometimes, when he opens in the morning, there are handprints on the floor. And sometimes, just for a second, he swears he sees a face staring back from the darkness under the counter.